From the studios of Farm Journal Broadcast, this is U.S. Farm Report.
Welcome to U.S. Farm Report this weekend. I'm Tyne Morgan, and here's what's in store over the next 60 minutes. As Trump taps key cabinet positions at a historic pace, what could some of the selections mean for agriculture?
He's got a record relative to renewable fuels, and it's not particularly positive.
With tariff talk heating up, could Trump actually be good for trade and hold Canada accountable on dairy?
They're flat out not doing what they promised to do. And I just don't see any way around calling them on the carpet for that.
But it's concerns about tariffs that caused commodity prices to tank this week. Claims about agriculture's impact on the environment. Are measurements even right?
These are our greenhouse gas chambers. We use this to get daily measurements of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, ammonia, and methane emissions.
How these South Dakota researchers are ground truthing claims and unearthing some problems with some of the calculations today. Now for the news, President-elect Trump spent this week nominating people to key positions in his cabinet. That includes former New York Congressman Lee Zeldin to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. Other key appointments announced this week include the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to serve as Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. Mr. Trump also announced he was nominating North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum to lead the Department of Interior. After ending his own presidential campaign last December, Burgum endorsed Mr. Trump and became an outspoken supporter. And Farm Journal Washington analyst Jim Wiesmeyer says a short list for the job of Ag Secretary has surfaced. As of Friday afternoon, Trump had not named the new Agriculture Secretary, but Wiesmeyer says there are 15 possible names in the running and being floated for that job, as you can see here. These are in no particular order. If he makes his selection soon, it will be quicker than his first term when he picked his Ag Secretary Sonny Perdue on January 19th, 2017. Well, Congress has now returned to Washington, and the lame duck session is poised to be hectic. They have about 5 weeks to pass a funding bill to keep the government open. They also face pressure to approve more disaster relief funds following Hurricanes Milton and Helene. Meanwhile, some farm bill programs expire at the end of this year. Before the election, the October Ag Economist's monthly monitor asked economists to weigh in on the fate of the farm bill. The majority said Congress will pass a new farm bill in 2025. 7% said it could happen yet this year.
I've been told that Klobuchar has told her people, and she's told Stabenow, by the way, let's get a bill done this calendar year. I think Stabenow may actually want a bill done because at least she'll be able to have some control over that bill where the Democrats won't in a Republican-controlled Senate beginning in the Congress in 2025. So it makes logical sense, doesn't it? Even though logic and Congress frequently don't go together.
This week, Senator John Thune won an internal election among Republican senators to become the chamber's next majority leader. It makes the South Dakota Republican a key partner on Capitol Hill to President-elect Donald Trump. Republicans are replacing Senate Mitch McConnell, the longest-serving Senate party leader, as they prepare to take majority control of the Senate with the 53 seats they won in last week's elections. And Republicans have now won enough seats to control the U.S. House, completing the party's sweep into power. Well, sales of tractors in the U.S. continue to slump. The Association of Equipment Manufacturers reporting the sale of all U.S. tractors last month were down 14% compared to the same month a year ago. Looking at year-to-date, tractors under 40 horsepower are down more than 14%. Under 100 horsepower are down almost 10%, and sales of 100-plus horsepower have fallen more than 15%. Sales of four-wheel drive tractors were up more than 1% for the year so far. Combine sales are down more than 23%. And CNH Industrial reported that its earnings fell 43% in the third quarter on that slump in the global ag economy. And now there are reports it may close a plant. The Des Moines Register reporting CNH is considering closing its plant in Burlington, Iowa. The company is saying in an email it's, quote, tentatively decided to move the production of backhoes, tractor loaders, and rough terrain forklifts out of Burlington plant to other CNH facilities in the U.S. and Europe, end quote. Now, if it moves forward with the decision to close the plant in mid-2026, it would leave close to 350 people without jobs. That's it for the news. Well, from rain to snow, more welcomed moisture this week. It's helping improve key river levels, but just how much improvement have we actually seen in the drought monitor over the past 2 weeks? We'll have a check of your weather coming up next.
U.S. Farm Report is brought to you by Pioneer.
Ben's bins, please hold.
Yeah, Ben's has been busy all day.
Seems like no one can keep up with this new Z series. What did you all put in these seeds?
Science.
U.S. Farm Report weather is brought to you by H&S Manufacturing. The Big Dog forage boxes feature stainless steel sides, front panel, and rear door and come in 26 and 30-foot models to fit your needs. Learn more at the H&S website.
Well, winter making its presence known this week. We had a couple winter storm warnings in the Pacific Northwest. It brought snow, freezing rain, and bitterly cold temperatures. But these systems are bringing some of the moisture across the rest of the country as well. And we've seen slight improvements in the drought monitor the past 2 weeks because of that. Meteorologist Jack Van Meter joining us now with more on that.
Taking a look at the newest version of the drought monitor, which recently came out, we can see that the East Coast, unfortunately, actually going to be in a little bit of trouble. Take a look at this, all the way from Maine all the way down to Florida, pretty much seeing abnormally dry conditions. As we can see, a little speck on the coast of New Jersey actually going to be in that extreme drought there. So something we're keeping, of course, very close eyes on, just because we start to see some of those brush fires really pop up out there. So again, something we are a little concerned of, but good news with the new update with the drought monitor is that a lot of parts of the country have started to recover because we've had a few systems move through and really put down some beneficial rain, especially near the Mississippi River, which is very good news there. As we can see, a nice hole of very moist conditions finally taking over. Moving out west, though, we can see again southwest Texas still very dry, and a part that is starting to just pop up right now is western Arizona, starting to move into those severe and actually extreme levels of drought. Walking through the jet stream, we can see a very dynamic pattern will be taking shape. By next Tuesday, actually, we could be seeing this ridging pattern start to form, but we're actually going to be seeing a trough trying to come and override that. So as I put this in motion, look at this. We have this large cut-off low that's going to be dipping down and giving a lot of folks, their first freeze of the year, and actually some people could be seeing their first snowflakes of the year as well. As we can see, that low really digs and then deepens as well as it's making its way, especially across the Great Lakes states. Here's the estimated rain for the next week. And as we can see, large system is going to be taking shape from Texas going all the way up through Kansas as well. As we can see, a large area of 2 inches of rain and even a large area actually of 3 inches of rain will be forecasted. And we're also watching parts of the panhandle of the Gulf there just to see some more Gulf moisture moving northward. So again, something we're keeping a very close eye on. Here's a precipitation outlook for the middle part of the month. And as we can see, that pattern starts to emerge where the ridge is, actually where that trough is. As we can see from Texas going all the way up through Idaho, very dry. Again, that's where that high pressure really is going to be setting up. So we make our way to the East Coast, especially down south and by the Great Lakes states, above average chances of precipitation.
Well, commodity markets seen extreme pressure this week. Was it more of the concerns about trade, or was it Trump's pick for leading EPA? We'll talk about it with Mark Gold and Mike North coming up right after the break. Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report this weekend. Mike North, Mark Gold joining us. Mike and Mark, when I asked you to be on the show, I didn't even know you would be together this week. Where are you guys?
We're in the mighty metropolis of Milwaukee at the American Bankers Association Ag Lenders Convention.
Well, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us this weekend. You know, after the election, surprisingly, we saw commodity markets respond positively. We saw some momentum in commodity prices. This week, it's been the opposite. Mike, what took the wind out of the commodity market sales this week?
Well, I would just say that we're going back to a bit of reality. I mean, anytime you go through a major event, there's a euphoria that steps into the marketplace that expresses itself. And then once the euphoria wears off, we go back to what I'll call a more normalized value, a fair value. And the market is just watched that happen over the course of the last week and a half.
Mark, President-elect Donald Trump picking his EPA administrator, Lee Zeldin. The market, though, seems nervous about that pick. Why?
I think the market's more nervous about potential trade wars, and I think they're overreacting. We're not doing that much business with the Chinese. When they go back and look at the old program that they signed onto, they've never fulfilled their commitments. And we think that if the president-elect starts something new, he's going to go back first thing and say, hey, let's finish up what you guys didn't do last time, and then we'll do something else. But I think the knee-jerk reaction, if he does put on tariffs, will be lower, but I think there's going to be a lot of end users coming in and buying it.
Mike, do you agree? Do you think it's more of the trade concerns versus the Lee Zeldin pick and the thoughts that maybe he could impact the RFS? Do you think that is more of the concern in the market right now?
Absolutely. It was the concern that preceded the election. And so as we carry it forward, everyone now realizing that Trump will take office is now asking the harder questions of not only is it a concern, but exactly how does it play out? And you're seeing some, restructuring in forward curve values, and the market is it's ready to embrace that. It's trying to get one step ahead of it, but we haven't even met the realities of this yet. As Mark pointed out, I think this could turn out to be a very positive story for agriculture, because we don't have to go through the tit for tat tariff standoff that we went through in 2018, and the negotiation process is likely to be much shorter. It's likely to be, hey, you signed this, let's go.
Yeah, Mark, we've seen China reduce their reliance on the U.S. with a number of proteins. I mean, you look at grains, and it hasn't just happened over the past 4 years. It's really been over the past 8 years that we've seen them reduce their reliance. So if it does come to a trade war with China, do you think that it would have the same impact today as it did during the first trade war?
No, I don't think so, because first of all, we're at $10 beans and less today. So I don't think that's a major issue. Part of the problem has been the reaction of the dollar to the election. The dollar has gone from 103, 104 up to new contract highs this morning of 106 and change. And that's really one of the big problems, particularly in the wheat market, is how are we going to sell wheat with the dollar so strong? We're worried about trade wars. We're worried about the dollar. We know Brazil now is going to have a big crop, and if all things stay equal, obviously they're heading into their major growing area from middle of December through January. If it gets hot and dry, then we'll have a bean market. What's interesting is that since we cut the bean carry out 80 million bushels in one shot, the beans have broken 40 cents a bushel off of that. Very unusual, but I think it's as much to do with the trade war and the dollar as anything else.
Yeah, well, Mark mentioned that dollar and the impact it had on wheat prices this week. But short term, are there any other commodities that we need to be worried about as we do see this U.S. dollar surge? We're going to ask Mike North that when we come back. Let's take a quick break first. Welcome back to U.S. Farm Report this weekend. If you're just now joining us, Mike North, as well as Mark Gold, joining us from the American Bankers Association Annual Ag Lenders Conference. Mike, we talked about the surge in U.S. dollar in the first roundtable. Mark mentioned the impact that it's already had on the wheat market. But if we do continue to see this U.S. dollar gain strength, what other commodities are you worried about?
Well, I think bottom line is, in partnership with a strong dollar, we often see a weaker energy market. And I think that's perpetuated further by some of the discussion around how Trump will come into office. If we go back to 2020, one of the first executive orders signed was to kill the Keystone Pipeline. You got to believe that that's coming back online. You got to believe that there's going to be other energy projects, that pick up from this. And I think as we talk about the energy complex, seeing a more domestic available product and a weaker price point, that will spur some changes in the broader spectrum of commodities, not just from how it impacts things like ethanol and the profitability at the plant, but also how we see the fund money come into the marketplace, because often the energy complex can be kind of the canary in the coal mine, if you will, around how the broader commodity investment play pans out.
Mark, let's talk cattle a little bit, okay? Because feeder traders really were continuing to anticipate short-term weakness in the cash markets for live and for feeder cattle. Why?
Well, that's a good question. You know, we've had this run up in the box beef again, back to 324, 325. We backed off again down to about 307 yesterday morning. The problem is we just don't have the cattle out there. Demand has been great, even at these higher levels. So, you know, to me, until we see more cattle come into this picture and we change these numbers around, you know, every time we've had a break in this market like we've seen now, we seem to come right back again.
Mike, you look at dairy exports, they've been strong as of late, but milk prices specifically, USDA announcing dairy farmers will soon vote on that federal milk marketing order reforms aimed at raising the price of fresh milk consumed at the table. But Mike, what is the impact this will have on farmers? Will this be a good change for dairy farmers?
So there's lots in the new recommendations that will have a positive impact. We're going to readjust skim milk component values to meet current fat and protein tests that have increased a lot over the last decade. We are going to make some adjustments, as you point out, to the class 1. You know, one of the unintended consequences of that particular move is that it may change the bottler's capacity to be competitive in the beverage case as we go head to head with this plethora of beverage choices in the marketplace. We're also, you know, going to see some regional adjustments to class pricing and some adjustments also to the make allowance. But, you know, as you look at that, there's going to be clearly some winners and losers nationwide from geography to geography. And it's entirely possible, as the producers vote on this, that we could see in some areas the federal order potentially become at risk of being voted out, because we don't just vote on the changes, Tyne, we vote on the whole order. So if they don't like the change and they vote against the change, they actually vote out the whole order.
Mark, real quick before we go, we mentioned you're at American Bankers Association Ag Lenders Conference, an annual conference. But right now, what is the mood of ag lenders out there?
You know, they're a little bit worried out here. You know, with $4 corn, $10 beans, it's very hard with these land prices where they are to make ends meet. And they're concerned that this, if it gets worse, there's going to be a lot of bankruptcies in this farm community. I don't think that's actually going to happen. I think there's some things down the road, like using ethanol and aviation fuel, that could be an absolute game changer out here.
Mike, Mark, thank you for joining us and taking the time. I know you've had a busy week there at ABA, so thank you so much. We need to take a quick break, and then we'll have much more right here on U.S. Farm Report.
Welcome back to Tractor Tales, folks. This week we're headed to Kansas to check out a Farmall BN that has a special connection to one of the darkest days in our nation's history, September 11th, 2001. This tractor was purchased from the farm next to Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where Flight 93 went down.
This tractor means a lot to me for many reasons. One being that the Model D Farmall was the first tractor I ever drove. Secondly, this tractor was located in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and my wife and I drove back to pick it up. And as we neared the location, we passed this meadow where Flight 93 went down and continued on to the farm where the tractor was located, which was a very short distance away. In fact, the site was visible from the farm where we bought this tractor. And it's been a very meaningful experience for me. It brings back the memories of 9/11. It brings back the horrendous things that not only happened in Shanksville, but elsewhere, and the horror and the loss of life in the Twin Towers. Every time I get this tractor out of the shop to take it to shows and such, and I do, it's an emotional thing. In fact, I'm struggling right now because it's to think of the people that went down in Flight 93, and it was within a very short distance. We could even speak in terms of feet from where the tractor was located. And I tell the story often at shows, and I struggle every time I tell it. And every time I get on the tractor to start it, I feel the seriousness of the situation that faced our country at that time.
Well, tariffs are once again the talk of Washington. Tariffs never went away during the Biden administration, but now with fresh threats from Trump, additional tariffs could be on the way. But it's also putting a focus back on trade. So will a Trump administration be good or bad for ag trade? That's actually our Farm Journal report coming up next.
You're watching U.S. Farm Report. Trusted, timely, tradition.
Well, if you look at the past 4 years, the trade front has been fairly quiet, but that's about to change. Should agriculture brace for another trade war, or could Trump actually be good for trade? That's this weekend's Farm Journal report. As President-elect Donald Trump released a slew of key cabinet and advisory picks at a historic pace this week, two names the U.S. ag sector is waiting on are who will be the next Secretary of Ag and the U.S. Trade Representative. The Financial Times reporting last week that Robert Lighthizer could make an encore performance as the U.S. Trade Representative under Trump.
And Trump and Bob Lighthizer are two peas in a pod when it comes to using tariffs to get what they want in amongst our trading allies.
And if it's a repeat of the last time Lighthizer held that seat, there will be an increased focus on trade and tariffs.
President-elect Trump was so strong on doing tariffs before that it's very likely that he'll follow through now. I mean, he's talked about at a minimum 20% tariffs on everybody. He's talked about 60% on China, and he's talked about putting them on Mexico if Mexico doesn't stop as many people coming across the border.
Ag groups want to focus back on trade, but they are also concerned it could come at a cost.
Mexico, Canada, China are always our number one, number two, number three ag markets. And so a lot of concern in agricultural circles about the fact that most likely that's where the retaliation starts first.
As tariff talk heats up, there are still tariffs in place today. The ag trade deficit is expected to balloon to $42 billion in 2025 under the current administration. And Indiana farmer Kip Tom, who served as the ambassador to the United Nations in the first Trump administration, argues the focus back on trade could bode well for ag.
When Trump was president, we did nearly 50 trade deals around the world. He did the phase one with China, and granted, we didn't get to phase two or phase three, but the reality is you got it put together and you got it started following the trade war that we had with him for a little bit. So I think trade is going to be number one.
Tom says Trump's next 4 years will be looking at new trade deals. But today, groups like U.S. Meat Export Federation also want any trade negotiations to do no harm.
I think if you look at 2024 on meat exports, pork, we'll start with pork. We're pulling our weight. We're going to have record volume and record value this year, approaching 8.5 billion or so on the pork side.
Dan Hallstrom is CEO of the U.S. Meat Export Federation. He says record demand from pork is broad-based, but the number one buyer is Mexico.
Mexico is being driven by everything. I mean, food service, retail, convenience stores. The buying power of the Mexican trade has been, it's been record-breaking, but also a little bit amazing.
Earlier this year, Mexico bumped out China as the United States' top trading partner. But in the final days of Trump's presidential campaign, he threatened to impose 25% tariffs on all Mexican imports if Mexico doesn't tighten the border. And this week, Mexico's economy minister said it's considering retaliatory tariffs of its own.
I think as long as we don't have any disruption, yes, I think it is very well positioned to continue. Of course, you have two new administrations coming in with a lot of talk about USMCA, but as long as we stay within the confines of the USMCA agreement and follow that, I think we're well positioned to continue this momentum in Mexico.
Another protein seeing positive demand from Mexico right now is dairy.
When the administration first negotiated USMCA, which was do no harm to what's working well. And for us, at least on the Mexico side, and I realize certainly on the biotech space, there's some issues, and the non-ag space, some issues. For dairy, that continues to be overall a really positive relationship. So working to help preserve that.
But for Canada, it's the Canadian side of the USMCA agreement that needs work. That's according to Shauna Morris, Executive Vice President of Trade Policy for National Milk Producers Federation.
I mean, they're flat out not doing what they promised to do. And I just don't see any way around calling them on the carpet for that. Yes, they eked out a win in the last, dispute settlement case the U.S. brought against them. If one judge had changed their mind, though, we would have been on the winning side, right? It's just a 3-person panel. This isn't gospel here we're talking about. What Canada's doing is shady and needs fixed.
She says between the way Canada administers the dairy tariff rate quota quantities to U.S. competitors to their excessive exports of dairy protein, dairy is a piece of the USMCA that they say needs addressed.
The last administration tried to deal with that in USMCA. We had some disciplines to try to tackle it in the agreement, and Canada has found some workarounds. Both of those issues are going to need to be on the table, I think, just in terms of USMCA cleanup and follow through.
Despite those challenges, dairy exports are picking up pace.
We just had a record, the highest quarter here in third quarter 2024 in about 2 years. Exports haven't been that strong since the very end of 2022, which was a record year for us.
Even with Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Mexico carrying the weight for exports, China is still the biggest wild card. We asked Morris if China does retaliate against Trump's threatened 60% tariffs, if it would have the same impact as it did during the last trade war.
China, even though it has pulled back on its global dairy imports, it's still our third largest export market. So it's a pretty sizable market, difficult to displace out into other markets, the volume of that production. But I think what we also saw the first time around, in addition to the pain and disruption caused by the retaliatory tariffs that were imposed, was at the end of the process, progress having been made.
China has also scaled back on their buys of U.S. pork, with exports down 11% so far this year. But Hallstrom points out even with increased tariffs now entering the picture again, tariffs the past 4 years never went away.
The thing to remember on these tariffs is, and we've had a tariff now for quite a few years on China, and on both beef and pork. It's not the ideal situation, but it doesn't eliminate trade.
Not even 2 weeks after the election, and Trump's playbook seems to be unfolding quickly. But some argue those tariffs may be just threats at first.
But here's what the Republicans tell me. Trump isn't going to invoke these across-the-board tariffs right away. He's going to use that as leverage to countries looking at their trade relationship with the U.S., and his key word is reciprocity. If you don't treat us like we treat you, then I'm going to invoke tariffs.
Those close to Trump seem to be in alignment. The U.S. needs fair trade.
When we're spending $500 billion in China and they're only spending $350 billion with us, we need to level that out a little bit. I'm very optimistic trade with Trump. I have no doubts that we'll get things put together. He knows farmers don't like to get their money from the government. They like to get it from the market. And so I'm really excited about that when we talk about trade. But yet, I know everybody's pretty edgy about it at this point in time.
Now, according to Wiesmeyer, China is already taking proactive measures to prepare for a potential trade war with the United States. That includes enacting comprehensive laws over the past 8 years that provide it with more tools to retaliate against U.S. actions. China has also redirected purchases of ag commodities like soybeans from American farmers to suppliers in Brazil and Argentina. Well, when we come back, speaking of China, President Biden holding a key meeting this weekend, and it could mark the final one during his administration. That's Ag Around the World next. Now for a glimpse of Ag Around the World. This week, President Biden is meeting with his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping. Many believe this will be the final time the two meet in person, with President Biden exiting in January. Reuters reporting the two were expected to hold talks on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum in Peru. It would be their first known interaction since a phone call all the way back in April. Officials say Mr. Biden will raise concerns about a Chinese-linked group that recently hacked into private telecommunications of U.S. officials and China's support for Russia in the war against Ukraine. Well, we put a wrap on export numbers for the 2024 fiscal year. Total ag exports coming in at $174.4 billion. That's a little better than experts had projected, but export volumes were down 2% from the previous year. Imports of foreign ag products grew by 5%, creating an ag trade deficit of almost $32 billion.
We saw a lot of competition globally for our bulk products and decreasing unit values for those products. And so while we exported quite a bit, we received less money for those exports. And so we saw values go down.
That's a look at ag around the world. Well, there's a lot of talk about tariffs, as we've been talking about, but how President-elect Trump uses those, well, that is up for debate. We talk about it in Chip's Corner coming up next. Well, we just talked about it in our Farm Journal report. What's the potential impact a Trump 2.0 administration could have on trade? But it's how the new administration would use tariffs that's making its way into the headlines again and stirring some debate. AgriTalk's Chip Flory joining us this weekend for more on that. Chip?
Yeah, Tyne, there are really two camps on how the Trump administration will use tariffs. Not if he's going to use tariffs. I think that's kind of a given, but how he is going to use tariffs. And now that we are going to get a second dose of Robert Lighthizer as the U.S. trade rep, I think that the use of tariffs is even more likely. So I had a conversation with former Deputy Assistant Trade Rep Ronald Baumgarten earlier this week on AgriTalk. It was a fascinating conversation. And I basically asked him, are we looking at a round of tariffs as a negotiating tool, or is the Trump administration really going to try to generate revenues for the federal government?
Whether or not one could fund the entire budget through tariff revenue, particularly given the way the authorities are now, that's quite uncertain. Although there could be, a component to it that's about raising revenue. On the other hand, there are voices that you might have heard and that I've heard coming from within the transition team that are more favorably disposed towards using the tariff authorities to bargain, as you're saying. So it's more of a reciprocity type concept. Look, U.S. has very low tariffs across the board, so you increase the tariffs, and then you have points of negotiation for market access with other countries.
Great perspective there, Chip. But what I just heard from that is the answer is actually both.
Yes, yeah, Tyne, that's how this trade rep sees it. Another thing that Mr. Baumgarten explained is that President Trump will need support from Congress to make these tariffs happen. So he can use things. He mentioned the Section 301, the Section 232 to initiate tariffs. There are ways that the White House can initiate tariffs. But going forward, when we know that we're going to have to get ready for it, what Baumgartner explained was watch for a mention of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. International Emergency Economic Powers Act. When you see that, it's going to be a clear indication that the administration is preparing some sweeping tariffs and general use of tariffs on all imports. So when we see that, that means that agriculture should probably prepare for a round of retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports as well. So there's going to be a lot of movement on this. One other thing that Baumgarten explained and mentioned, we cannot forget that the first Trump administration was very high on bilateral trade agreements. Multilateral with multi-countries, not so much. But bilateral trade agreements, he was very much in support of those kinds of agreements. So watch for development on that front, complete with the reciprocity that gains U.S. markets access into those other markets as well.
Thanks, Chip. You can catch him twice a day for AgriTalk. Well, Trump's pick for EPA this week created some nervousness for biofuels. Michelle Rook digs into why next. Well, President-elect Trump is continuing to build his future administration. One of his nominees is former New York Congressman Lee Zeldin to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. Farm Journal's Michelle Rook has more on the impact he could have on the biofuels industry. Michelle?
Tyne, this appointment could signal a potential shift in environmental and biofuels policy and regulatory approach from a second Trump administration. Former Congressman Zeldin lacks extensive experience in environmental policy, but his background, agenda, and his voting record indicate he frequently voted against environmental and biofuels legislation. Former President Trump has stated Zeldin would ensure fair and swift regulatory decisions to unleash the power of American businesses. Zeldin is expected to focus on restoring U.S. energy dominance and revitalizing the auto industry, and his past record has been anti-biofuels.
He's got a record relative to renewable fuels, and it's not particularly positive. In 2017, then Congressman Zeldin co-sponsored two bills, one which repealed the renewable fuel standard, another which would really dismantle it to the point where it would not be an effective tool and would prohibit any blend above E10.
In 2015, Zeldin and other members of Congress sent a letter to EPA with concerns about the proposed 2016 renewable volume obligations under the RFS, saying the mandates would break the E10 blend wall and drive up prices for consumers. So Jennings says they have work to do in the confirmation process to get answers on how Zeldin will implement E15, the RFS, and small refinery exemptions.
I don't have to remind your viewers that we had a very challenging time under the first Trump administration with all of the small refinery exemptions that were issued that really undermined the renewable fuel standard.
As far as 45Z tax credits, EPA doesn't have jurisdiction over the program, and only Congress can overturn the program. But
what President Trump can do, and what we expect him to do, Michelle, is effectively put a pause on all pending regulatory efforts by the Biden administration.
Zeldin will also undo Biden administration environmental regulations, particularly those targeting power plant pollution and vehicle emissions, allowing construction of new natural gas export terminals, and potentially withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. Environmental advocates have criticized the nomination, seeing it as potential regression in environmental and climate policy and support for increased fossil fuel production. I'm Michelle Rook for U.S. Farm Report.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, how much of an impact does agriculture and farming actually have on the environment? We may not have actual measurements, but a team of researchers in South Dakota is working to change that. Clinton Griffiths has that story next. Well, climate-smart agriculture is the latest buzzword from Washington. But before you can make a claim about how agriculture and farming are impacting the environment, you first need to make sure the measurements are right. Clinton Griffiths talked with researchers in South Dakota doing just that.
Soil, soil, soil. Thousands of samples cover nearly every inch of the lab here at SDSU. The goal is to quantify and measure what's really happening in the soil at farm fields across the state.
We talk about the importance to them on improving their soil health because it improves their profitability and it increases their yields that they're likely to see.
Clay has been working in agronomy for 30 years and he's witnessed real change. For instance, when comparing soil from the drought of 1974 to soils from 2012.
And what we saw was over a 25-year period, our soil organic levels had increased 24%. Each increase is increased water and it's reduced erosion.
Now he and a team of researchers are taking on a new challenge. Here in the field.
These are our greenhouse gas chambers. We use this to get daily measurements of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, ammonia, and methane emissions.
They're trying to put a real number on what's being emitted from the soil and how that changes based on management practices.
These chambers will swivel closed and open. When it swivels closed, it will create an airtight seal with the soil. It will start to mix the air that's in the chamber, and then it will sample that air.
Taking 900 samples at a time, 6 times a day, much better than previous methods that sampled maybe once a day or even once a week.
If we did a life cycle analysis, which is to quantify greenhouse gas emissions, those models predict that we lose 1% of the nitrogen fertilizer that we apply to our fields as nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. What our research is showing that we have about half of that.
What they're finding, farmers are doing a better job than old data and models suggest, as new management practices like cover crops are already making a difference.
Organic matter is increasing, our erosion has decreased 30% over a period of time. They've increased adoption of reduced tillage systems and no tillage.
The next step will be not just reducing emissions, but actively managing the microbes that create them.
We know that emissions are coming from the microbial community, and we need to understand how that is having a conversation with our plants and our management strategies so that we can use the management strategies to essentially reduce emissions.
It's a complex and complicated web, and these researchers are working to understand for farmers and for our future.
Thanks, Clinton. That does it for U.S. Farm Report this weekend. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to tune in again next weekend as we work to build on our tradition. Have a great weekend, everyone.
U.S. Farm Report is produced and distributed by Farm Journal Broadcast.